Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his review of the work The Two Ages in the section devoted to the present age, providing a critique of the modern period that he is living in, perhaps with some implications for our own times, Søren Kierkegaard is going to talk about a number of different ways in which a passionate disjunction between two polarities has been annulled or negated, and the effects that this has for the individual person and society, and this is going to be connected with what he calls the public. Now, he goes through a number of these, but the one which he begins with and talks about at greatest length is the distinction between being silent and speaking and what ends up coming in its place. But before we jump into that, there's a little bit of background that we should re-elaborate just to remind ourselves about why this really matters. So he tells us that in the present age, what we end up seeing is reflection, devoid of passion, and gaining in extensity what it loses in intensity. And he says, the existential expression of nullifying the principle of contradiction. Now, this sounds very, very abstract. What is the principle of contradiction? It's saying, it's a logical principle that we get out of logic and metaphysics, but we can also apply to moral matters. Something cannot be and not be in the same way at the same time. And this, how does it fit into ethical or moral matters or religious matters for Kierkegaard? Well, we decide between two alternatives that are opposed to each other, or maybe we don't. So he says the existential expression of nullifying the principle of contradiction is to be in contradiction to oneself. And he talks about the creative omnipotence for each of us, implicit in the passion of absolute disjunction, that leads an individual resolutely to make up his mind. This is something that otherwise was available for us, is transformed into the extensity of prudence and reflection by knowing and being everything possible to be in contradiction to oneself. That is to be nothing at all. And he says the principle of contradiction strengthens the individual in faithfulness to themselves. You make a decision and now you're stuck with it, right? But you have actually decided, you have committed. What if you don't commit? What if instead you nullify this disjunction? So he says that you're going to wind up in contradiction to yourself, and he talks about chattering. So he says, well, what is it to chatter? It is the annulment of the passionate disjunction between being silent and speaking. Now, notice this isn't just a logical disjunction. This is a passionate disjunction. It has to do with our affectivity. It has to do with our will. It has to do with what we commit ourselves to. And this is the person who, in a certain sense, tries to have it all, rather than saying, well, I've got to pick this or this. And in trying to have it all, they wind up losing both sides and slipping into something different. So we can represent this by putting being silent on one side of this passionate disjunction, putting speaking on the other side of this passionate disjunction, and talk about the resolute making up of one's mind. Now, of course, it's not as if you commit yourself, most people, to only speaking or only being silent. What ends up happening is you alternate between the two of them. You fall silent for a while, and then you decide there's something actually worth saying, so you say it. And then you go back into silence again, and you oscillate between the two. And as Kierkegaard is going to tell us, you need the silence in order to actually speak. So he says, only the person who can remain essentially silent can speak essentially. So this shows us that we can speak essentially. We can also use our faculty of speech in non-essential ways. That's part of what chattering is going to be. But notice the next line after that. Can act essentially. So under speaking, we should understand not simply speaking, but also acting. And as he's going to talk about it a little bit later, producing things through linguistic expressions or perhaps other modes of expression as well. And he tells us that silence is inwardness. So this is quite important. We bring something out of ourselves that is there in that silence, and that is what we speak. I mean, we can speak about other things as well. All of our speaking doesn't have to be culling our feelings or thoughts out of great inwardness. It can have reference to the world. It can have reference to other people. But there has to be silence, or else it's not truly speaking. And he says chattering gets ahead of essential speaking. Giving utterance to reflection has a weakening effect on action by getting ahead of it. And, think in our own time about people who can't just say what they're going to say. They've got to do a little preamble first, and they've got to have all sorts of little affectations, and they've got to have provisos, and then they need to ask people, what do you think about that, and get everybody else involved in the act of taking a stand through speaking. And this doesn't just have to be speaking. This could be in writing. This could be in social media. This could be in a myriad of different ways. So he says that the person who can speak essentially, because he's able to keep silent, will not have a profusion of things to speak about, but one thing only, the thing that they actually need to talk about, whatever it happens to be at that time, and he will find time to speak and to keep silent. Now, this is where it gets really interesting temporally. If you really only have one thing that you need to say, you don't need to talk all the time. You've said it. Now you can allow silence and let other people digest what it is that you've said. Think about it. I mean, you could repeat yourself. You could talk about other aspects of the thing that you've just set out there. But at a certain point, you get to shut up. And you don't have to keep going on and on. Instead, talkativeness, he says, gains in extensity. And he'll also talk about this as externality in just a bit as well. It chatters about anything and everything and continues incessantly. The person who has to talk just to talk. You've encountered many people like that. Perhaps you've yourself fallen into that at one point or another through nervousness, through embarrassment, through not wanting there to be empty space and time and, a lack of language, you could say. By contrast, he says, when individuals are not turned inward in quiet contentment, that's what's possible in silence, in inner satisfaction and religious sensitiveness, but in a relation of reflection, are oriented to externalities, things outside of themselves, and to each other. When no important event ties the loose threads together in the unanimity of a crucial change, then chattering begins. People talk and they chatter when there's really nothing else going on. And so he contrasts this against a passionate age. So he's not saying that this is the case for everybody all the time, even in modernity. It's possible to have a present age of reflection. It's also possible to have a preceding passionate age, and perhaps we could even move back into another passionate age. So he says, chattering has a great deal to chatter about. By contrast, when an important event has taken place, after it's happened, you fall silent. You don't need, after you've spoken, to keep on chattering about this. He says, chattering dreads the moment of silence. And now notice this phrase, which would reveal the emptiness of not having anything to truly value or even to talk about. So it talks about everything. And he gives prime examples. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. He talks about the novel itself. The substance is mere trifles, but they're always about specific people mentioned by name whose trivial lives are interesting because of their names. One who chatters presumably does chatter about something, since the aim is to find something to chatter about. But this something is not something in the sense of ideality, a term that he's using here. Now, he doesn't mean ideality in the sense of abstraction from life. He doesn't mean ideality either in the sense of some sort of far-off paradigm or pattern. This isn't Platonic ideality. This is thinking about what is great, what matters, what has value in the real world that we are living in. And so coming back to the text, he says, the law manifest in poetic production is identical on a smaller scale with the law for the life of every person in social intercourse and education. So there is an analogy being drawn there. Poetic production produces books or plays or music, or we can go on and on and on. It might even produce important things happening in human affairs. And then we have our own smaller individual scale, every person in social intercourse and education. So he says, anyone who experiences anything primitively also experiences in ideality the possibilities of the same thing and the possibility of the opposite. These possibilities are his legitimate literary property. His own personal actuality is not. His speaking and his producing, notice how these go hand in hand, are, as he's going to tell us, going to correspond to his silence. The supreme mark of that silence will be that the ideality contains the qualitatively opposite possibility. So we have opposites in two different ways here. You could say we have an opposite of content, right? What it is and its opposite. But we also have opposites being silent and giving articulation, speaking, bringing this into being in front of us, being able to talk about the opposites. And Kierkegaard will actually give us an example here as well. He tells us that ideality is the equilibrium of opposites. Someone who has been motivated to creativity by unhappiness, which is often the case, isn't it? If he is genuinely devoted to ideality, will be equally inclined to write about happiness and about unhappiness, but silence, the brackets he puts around his own personality, is precisely the condition for gaining ideality. So, sometimes people say, well, you've got to write what you know. Well, yes and no. Kierkegaard is saying, don't do a tell-all. Don't make yourself the subject that you're throwing out there and then talk in all sorts of trivialities about yourself and get into nervous neuroticism about whether you're revealing yourself enough or any, I mean, that's reflection. That's chattering. That's another word that he's going to use, garrulousness. Speak. Go ahead and speak forth. You can mention yourself. You can talk about your own place in things, but don't reveal everything or feel like you have to fill the page or fill the air or whatever else. Fill the Twitter or Facebook thread with lots and lots of stuff. So he goes on and he says that what holds true in the large picture, because it appears most clearly there, also holds true in a lesser way in the smaller picture. Silence is the condition for cultured conversation between human being and human being. The more a person has ideality and ideas in silence, this oscillation between being silent and speaking, the more they will be able, even in daily associations, to reproduce his daily life and that of others in such a way that he seems to be speaking only at a distance about specific matters. The less ideality, the more we're chattering, the more the conversation becomes a trivial, rattling, and name-dropping. And again, Kierkegaard is writing this nearly 2 centuries ago, but doesn't this seem as if it could be right out of the present for many of the conversations we're involved in? He says, references to persons with absolutely reliable private information on what this one and that one mentioned by name have said, a garrulous confiding of what he himself wants or does not want, his plans, what he would have said on that occasion, what girl he is courting, why he is not still ready to get married, etc. In order to have cultured conversation, Kierkegaard tells us, inwardness, being silent, is actually necessary. You need to leave space, pauses, so that the speaking has something to contrast with. He goes on a little bit further and says this really interesting thought experiment. Suppose a law were passed and could be maintained that did not forbid people to speak, but merely ordered that everything spoken about had to be spoken about as if it had happened 50 years ago. Then all the chatterers would be sunk. Why? Because they chatter about stuff that doesn't really matter. And they chatter about it in a way that makes it sound as if it matters, but reveals that it doesn't matter. The many trivialities of our opinions, our judgments, our reactions, if we were going to see them at a distance of 50 years, would they be valuable? Would they be worth speaking about? Or would we keep silent about them? We probably, unless we're congenital chatterers, people who no longer know how to be silent or speak, perhaps because of the age they live in, perhaps because they've never encountered other people who know how to be silent or speak, or because they couldn't recognize them. If we're like that, then we'll just keep on talking and talking and talking. Think about all these shows that we fill our streaming content with about things that are taken very, very seriously by the people in the shows, but are just complete wastes of our time. Or the tiffs that people get into over the topic of the day, whether it's on the right or left or center, or pick some other orientation. There's so much that people chatter about that if we applied this test, this thought experiment, perhaps people wouldn't care about it anymore, right? So he says, by this chattering, the disjunction between what is private and what is public is also nullified in a private-public garrulousness, which is just about what the public is. So he's telling us something really important here about this key idea that he has of the public. What in other places he's called the crowd, abetted by the press. So he tells us the public is public opinion that is interested in what is utterly private, something no one would dare present at a meeting, something that no one would be able to speak about, something even gossips would scarcely admit to having chattered about, can very well be put in writing for the public and be known by the public as the public. And again, think about so many different television shows with people who appear to be important but are ultimately just trivialities, mere placeholders. You know, what is their relationship to each other? Did they go on a date with each other? Why are they mad at each other? You know, what about this thing over here and this thing over here and who went to what party? That's just chatter from Kierkegaard's perspective. And if we want to have a more full, rich, meaningful, authentic life, we probably need to figure out, if we are chattering and perhaps chatterers, how to get back to this passionate disjunction between being silent and speaking.